different parameter and return types. When you call a function, you can provide arguments of different types, and the return value can actually return different types as well. Any Python type is legal for either case. So, for example, in computing a hypotenuse, as written here, takes the sides a and b of a triangle and returns the hypotenuse c, which is the square root of a squared plus b squared, because a squared plus b squared should equal c squared. So when this function takes integers, it actually returns a floating point number, 5.0, rather than 5. As you see it run right here, there's your 5.0. The reason for that is the square root function will always return a floating point number even when the result is integral. So this is a function that returns a floating point number. By the way, this function also returns, let's go over here, when you call it print hypotenuse, well, we had 3, 4, and sure enough, that was 5.0. But you can also send in floating point numbers as well. So this function takes integers or floating point numbers. Any function can really take any value. The question is if it can make sense out of it. Here, for instance, if I put in, say, Wilma, it will crash because it takes Wilma in, it tries to square that string, and it can't square a string, so it crashes and says, I can't square a string. So functions can take values that are of any legal Python type. And here we return a float. You can return other kinds of values, like XOR, which is intended to be true if one but not both of its arguments are true. It takes in Boolean values, true or false, and it returns Boolean values as well, true or false. Is positive, which we saw a moment ago in the examples, takes in an integer or a float and returns a Boolean, that is true or false. We've seen other functions as well already, such as cubed, which takes in an integer and returns an integer, or it takes in a float and returns a float. And that's worth seeing, that the return type of this function is going to depend on the calling type. So if I print cubed of 3, I get 27. But cubed of 3.2 is not an integer, of course, it's a float. Where you really see this is if I cube 3.0. This is a float, not an integer, and the result is a float as well. So the return type can actually depend upon the type of the argument.